In the summer of 1789, a 4-pound loaf of bread cost nearly a full day's wages in Paris. That single fact explains almost everything that followed. Paris, in 1789, held roughly 600,000 people crammed into narrow streets that rarely saw direct sunlight. Most of them spent between half and 80% of their income just on bread. Not meat, not wine, bread. The coarse, dark kind that left your hands smelling of grain all morning. When bread was affordable, the city functioned. When it wasn't, the city watched. And by the spring of 1789, it hadn't been affordable for a very long time. The harvests of 1788 had failed badly across much of France, hit by drought and then hailstorms. What grain survived the summer was then battered by one of the coldest winters in living memory. Rivers froze. Mills stopped grinding. Supply chains that were already fragile simply broke. In Paris, bakers started limiting how much each customer could buy, sometimes posting guards at the door. Women who arrived at dawn sometimes waited 4 hours and left with nothing. That waiting wasn't passive. It was the place where anger got organized, quietly, in the cold. The French state knew the bread situation was dangerous. It had always known this. For generations, the crown had maintained a rough system of price controls and grain reserves for exactly this reason. But by 1789, the royal treasury was effectively bankrupt, drained by decades of war, including support for the American Revolution. The government could not buy its way out of the shortage this time. What it could do, and what it did, was call the Estates General, a political assembly that hadn't met since 1614. That decision opened a door the monarchy had assumed it could control. It could not. The Estates General brought thousands of grievance lists to Versailles, documents called cahiers de doléances, written across France. Many of them mentioned bread directly, many of them mentioned tax. Nearly all of them mentioned hunger. Versailles itself was about 12 miles from Paris, a distance that mattered enormously. The king and his ministers lived inside a palace designed to project permanence and abundance. Paris, 12 miles away, was standing in line. By June, the political situation had cracked open further. The Third Estate, representing commoners, had broken away and declared itself a national assembly. Louis XVI closed their meeting hall. They moved to a nearby tennis court and swore not to disband until France had a constitution. The crown responded by massing troops around Paris and Versailles through early July. In Paris, that troop buildup looked like preparation for a crackdown. Rumor moved faster than fact. On July 11th, news reached Paris that the king had dismissed Jacques Necker, his finance minister and one of the few officials the public trusted. By the standards of 1789, that was the equivalent of pulling the last rope holding the situation together. The next day, July 12th, a young journalist named Camille Desmoulins climbed onto a table outside the Palais Royal Café. He was shaking by his own account. He pulled a green leaf from a tree and held it up as a cockade. He told the crowd that foreign troops were coming and that the city needed to arm itself. Whether his account of his own speech is fully accurate, historians have questioned. What happened next is not in doubt. The crowd moved. Through the night of July 12th and into the 13th, the city began organizing itself under the watch of newly formed citizen militias. Gunsmiths were broken into. Arsenals were searched. People who had never held a weapon were learning how to load one. The militia needed weapons, but they also needed gunpowder. Both pointed them toward the same place, the Bastille. The Bastille was a medieval fortress on the eastern edge of the city, used by then primarily as a prison and a royal armory. In July 1789, it held 7 prisoners. That number matters because the fortress had an enormous symbolic weight that bore no relation to its actual current population. It represented arbitrary royal power. It represented letters de cachet, royal orders that could imprison a man without trial and without stated cause. In the popular imagination, it was full. In reality, on July 14th, it held 7 men, 4 forgers, 2 lunatics, and 1 aristocrat imprisoned for behavior his own family found embarrassing. The governor of the Bastille, Bernard René de Launay, spent the morning of July 14th in a position with no good options. He had 82 veteran soldiers, 32 Swiss guards, and enough cannon to make any frontal assault extremely costly. He also had very little food and no reinforcements on the way. Negotiations began in the morning. Two delegations from the city went inside. Neither returned with a satisfying answer. The crowd outside grew through the late morning, somewhere between 300 and 1,000 people depending on which account you trust. Around 1:30, the chains on the outer drawbridge were cut or fell. Accounts vary, and the crowd surged into the outer courtyard. Delaunay's men opened fire. Somewhere between 80 and 100 people were killed in the hours that followed. Then the garrison surrendered. Delaunay was taken out of the fortress. He was killed in the street before he reached the city hall, his head carried on a pike through Paris by evening. The Bastille was dismantled stone by stone over the following months, the rubble sold as souvenirs. A man named Pierre-François Palloy made a small fortune selling pieces of it. Some were carved into tiny model Bastilles. History contains multitudes. What the fall of the Bastille actually accomplished militarily was almost nothing. The gunpowder found inside was limited, the weapons were old. The 7 prisoners walked out blinking into daylight. What it accomplished symbolically was total. Louis XVI, at Versailles, was woken and told what had happened. His diary entry for July 14th reportedly read simply, "Nothing." He had not yet received the news. When he did, he is said to have asked whether it was a revolt. His advisor reportedly told him, "No, sire, it is a revolution. That exchange has been polished over the years, and may be partly apocryphal." The underlying dynamic, however, was real. The king genuinely did not understand the speed or the depth of what was happening 12 miles from his palace. Within days, Louis XVI traveled to Paris, wore a tricolor cockade publicly, and acknowledged the National Assembly. It was an extraordinary reversal, a king essentially ratifying what a crowd had forced. But the bread problem had not been solved. The hunger that started everything was still there. Through August, the National Assembly moved quickly. Feudal privileges were abolished in a session that ran through the night of August 4th. Noble after noble stood up and surrendered rights their families had held for centuries, caught up in a momentum that by morning, several of them quietly regretted. The Declaration of the Rights of Man was adopted in late August, a document that borrowed from Enlightenment philosophy and American precedent. It declared liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression as natural rights. Bread was not mentioned. The price of bread was not mentioned. The women who had waited in line since dawn were not mentioned. In October, they made themselves impossible to ignore. On October 5th, a crowd gathered at the Paris City Hall. Predominantly women, market workers, and laboring families pushed past their limit. They were angry about bread prices specifically. Bread was still expensive. The harvest was in, but distribution was slow, and speculation continued. Someone produced a drum. The crowd began marching in the rain toward Versailles, 12 miles. By the time they arrived, thousands of people were behind them, including units of the National Guard under Lafayette. They surrounded the palace. They presented demands directly. Louis agreed to release the royal grain stores and to accept the August decrees he had been stalling on. But the crowd wanted more than promises. The next morning, some entered the palace through an unguarded entrance. The queen's bodyguards were killed in the corridor outside her rooms. Marie Antoinette barely escaped through a connecting door. By mid-morning, the crowd was demanding that the royal family return to Paris, to live among the people rather than behind the gates of Versailles. The king agreed. The royal family traveled back to Paris that afternoon, surrounded by the same crowd that had marched out the day before. The procession took 6 hours. People carried loaves of bread on pikes alongside the royal carriage. Some carried the heads of the queen's guards. It was, by any measure, an extraordinary scene that no choreographer could have designed or predicted. The king and queen settled into the Tuileries Palace in Paris, effectively under the watch of the city. They would never return to Versailles. The revolution continued for years after this point, moving through phases that grew progressively more radical and more violent. The constitutional monarchy gave way to a republic. The republic gave way to the terror gave way to exhaustion. And then, Napoleon. But the thread running back to the beginning was always the bread. Not abstract ideology, not philosophy. A price, a shortage, a wait in the cold. The Enlightenment provided the vocabulary. The grain crisis provided the fuel. There is a common assumption that the French Revolution was primarily an intellectual event, a product of Voltaire and Rousseau filtering down to the streets. The books mattered. The ideas mattered. But ideas move fastest when people are hungry. In 1789, the philosophical and the physical collided in one city, in one summer, at a very specific price per loaf. The political structures that collapsed had been weakening for decades under debt, inequality, and institutional rigidity. What 1789 showed is that systems rarely fail from one cause. They fail when multiple stresses arrive at the same time. A bad harvest, an empty treasury, a political miscalculation, a rumor about troops, and a crowd that had simply waited long enough. No single actor planned the storming of the Bastille. No single actor planned the march to Versailles. Both emerged from accumulated pressure finding the path of least resistance. That is not a satisfying story for people who prefer history driven by great decisions or great villains, but it is probably closer to what actually happened. As always, with a period this turbulent and this extensively documented by competing factions, specific details, dates, and accounts vary across sources. The numbers of dead, the exact sequence of events on July 14th, and the precise wording of reported conversations remain subjects of ongoing historical discussion. What the evidence consistently supports is the shape: hunger, institutional failure, accelerating crisis, and a city that stopped waiting for permission. The Bastille was mostly empty. The revolution was mostly unplanned. And the bread was genuinely that expensive.